How's everybody doing tonight?
Great.
Gover, I love that enthusiastic. Yay! It's good. No, you're good. No. You do not have to. You don't have to go that far. I appreciate it though. Well, welcome in tonight, guys. We are continuing our series called Messy Life. We have about counting tonight. We have 3 more weeks left in this series. Tonight we're looking at Samson. Next week we're going to look at King David, one of my favorite Bible characters of all time. And then we're going to look at a young lady from the New Testament by the name of Martha. But tonight we're going to be looking at the life of Samson. Now, Samson is an interesting character because most of the characters that we have been looking at here were called by God, which Samson is. But most of them showed an act of faith and then at some point in their life ended up committing a sin, ended up falling into sin and temptation. Now, while Samson was called by God and set apart by God, his entire life was a disaster. According to him, everything went to plan, but nothing went right. His life was full of sin and rebellion against God. But it was at the very end of his life that we see his faith brought out. And it's because of that that we find Samson in Hebrews chapter 11. Tonight our main text is going to be Judges 13 through 16. I encourage you to flip there and follow through as we go through the entire life of Samson tonight. But for this sermon, we are looking at Hebrews 11. Or for this series, we're looking at Hebrews 11 and looking at these heroes of faith. And down in verse 32, it says this. He's running out of time in this letter, and he says, "What more can I say? Time is too short for me to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Japheth, David, Samuel, and the prophets, by whom faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, obtained promise, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the raging fires, escaped the edge of the sword, gained strength in weakness, became mighty in battle, and put foreign armies to flight." And so there's this long list that he just runs through really quick of these great judges in Gideon, Barak, and Japheth, these great kings and prophets in Samuel and David, and all of their mighty works. But when we come to the life of Samson and you really get down to the nitty-gritty, his life was full of rebellion. Most of us who grew up in church may know the stories of Samson, of Samson and Delilah, where he lied to her to save his own skin. And we're going to look at that in detail, but that was the end of Samson's life. That was just another domino in a life full of problem after problem. Now, Samson's story takes place in the time of the Judges. This is after Joshua had taken Israel into the land of Canaan, and they had conquered it. And it is before King Samuel and King Saul and King David had been appointed. So there was not really a leader over Israel. And it caused a problem. In both chapter 17 of Judges, and there's other places in Judges as well, but in chapter 17 and in Ruth chapter 1, it tells us it was the time of the judges, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And because of this attitude, there was a cycle in the judges where Israel would rebel against God. God would punish them. Another nation would come in and either conquer, rule over, or just be a pain in their side. They would cry out to God. God would send a judge. The judge would rescue them. They would turn back to God for a short time. Then they would rebel, and the cycle would repeat over and 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 over again. I think I got them all. So it just keeps repeating. And so by the time we get to Samson, we're through this cycle about 4 or 5 times. And we pick up the story in Samson chapter 13, and it talks of his birth. And it is a miraculous birth, which is a theme that we see throughout Scripture. Whenever God is going to do something and use somebody, most of the time there is a miraculous birth. And there's a man from the family of Dan whose name is Manoah. And his wife cannot have any children. And so one day, Manoah's wife is just hanging out, and an angel of the Lord comes to her. Now, she didn't recognize him as an angel of the Lord, but she just saw him as a messenger. And the messenger says to her, hey, you're going to conceive, verse 5, conceive and give birth to a son. You must be careful and not drink wine or beer or eat anything unclean. You must never cut his hair, for the boy will be a Nazirite to God from birth, and he will begin to save Israel from the power of the Philistines. And I want to highlight this word, begin. And we'll get back to this word here in just a minute, but I want to highlight that it says he will begin to save Israel from the Philistines. And so she comes to him, and this angel of the Lord comes to her and tells her, hey, you're going to have a baby. But here's the thing. He must follow the Nazirite vow. Now, this Nazirite vow is an interesting thing. It's first mentioned in Numbers chapter 6, and it's also mentioned in Deuteronomy. And a Nazirite vow is a vow that normally an adult man would take, where he is separating himself and consecrating himself to God for a short time, for whatever reason, to grow closer to God, to see what God's will for his life was, to a time of sickness. And normally it was for a period of about 60 to 90 days. And the main three things that a Nazirite would have to do is you couldn't cut your hair, you couldn't have anything off of the vine. So you couldn't, drink wine, drink alcohol. You couldn't have grape juice. You couldn't even eat a grape off the vine in case it had fermented and caused you to break that vow. And then the other thing you couldn't do is eat meat, or not eat meat. You couldn't touch anything undead, which would lead you to not being able to eat meat. It would normally be a vegetarian diet. And so those were the three main stipulations of this, and it was for a short period of time. It was very ceremonial, and it was very restricted. Like, you had to follow this to a T, and if you ever broke it along the way, there was this other ritual that you had to go through in order to return back and be seen as clean and not scar yourself as breaking your Nazirite vow. So this was to be the life of Samson. And so Samson was promised to be born. Manoah's wife went to him and said, hey, this guy came and told me I'm going to have a baby. He's got to be a Nazirite. And he goes, are you sure? So they prayed to God for another sign. And sure enough, the angel of the Lord came and brought them another sign. And they believed that they were going to have a son. And at the end of chapter 13, we see that Samson is born. The boy grew. The Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him in the camp of Dan between Zorah and I can't even pronounce that last word, so I'm not even going to try. But in between these two cities in which he was standing. In chapter 14, Samson is now grown, and he is of age, and he begins walking around. Now, Samson goes down to the town of Timnah, and here we get our first view at Samson and his biggest weakness, which was women. And he saw a young Philistine woman there, and he went back to his father and mother, and he tells them, I have seen a young Philistine woman in Timnah. Get her for me as a wife. And his parents looked at him, and they said, Samson, why do you got to go to the Philistine women? Why don't you just get a nice, sweet Israelite young lady that's, part of the tribe? It'd be great, right? Just go and get a nice, sweet woman. And he turns, this blows my mind, because if I ever said this to my dad, he would have knocked me out. He goes, get her for me. She is right for me. And so basically he demands that his father go and do whatever it takes to make this woman his. Now here's what's interesting. In verse number 4, it says, even though his father and mother protested, it says, now his father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, who wanted the Philistines to provide an opportunity for confrontation. At that time, the Philistines were ruling over Israel. So here's what this tells you. God had chosen Samson, but in his omniscience, that's the wrong word, in his ability to know everything that was going to happen, Samson, God knew that Samson was going to rebel. So he needed a reason for Samson to accomplish his will. And despite all of Samson's shortcomings and all of the sin that he lived in, God was still able to accomplish His will. It was from the Lord. And God was using this as an opportunity to upset Samson so that he could go and enact His judgment upon the Philistine people. So it's a very interesting phrase that I think often gets overlooked here. Samson was going to be rebellious, but God was going to use him in spite of that. So his parents go and they arrange a wedding. And they arrange everything. They make several trips back and forth as they arrange this marriage. And finally, it's time for the wedding. The wedding would be a week long. And on the first day of the wedding, there was supposed to be a bachelor party. Well, Samson didn't bring anybody with him because he's kind of a solo shot guy. He's all on his own. It's all about him. So the family provides 30 Philistine men to be part of his bachelor party. And there's a lot of male bravado and posturing going on during this bachelor party. And they begin passing back and forth riddles. And Samson drops a riddle on these guys and makes a bet with them. He says, hey, if you can answer this riddle, I will buy each of you, all 30 of them, a change of clothes, which would be very expensive for him to do. But if you can't answer this riddle, then each of you have to buy me a change of clothes. And Samson knew he had it in the bag, and he gave this riddle here. He says, out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. Now, there's no way that these men could ever know that answer to that riddle, because this riddle is something that Samson wrote himself. Because you see, on his many trips back and forth setting up this wedding, he had gone walking in a vineyard, something he should not have done, and he was attacked by a lion. And as he was attacked by this lion, he used his bare hands to kill the lion. On another trip back, as he passed by this lion laying on the side of the road, he saw that some bees had made a home and created honey inside the rib cage of this lion. So Samson goes over, he touches the dead lion, which he's not allowed to do, eats some of the honey, and then brings it to his parents and has them unknowingly eat this honey that came from the dead lion. And so when you look at this, it makes a whole lot of sense. Out of the eater, the lion, came something to eat, the honey. Out of the strong came something sweet. And so he knew that there was no possible way they could answer this riddle because they didn't know his story. Well, these men knew that. And they must not have had a lot of money because they started panicking. And so they decided the only way that they could get the answer is to go to Samson's wife. They go to her and they say, you need to find out the answer to this riddle. And if you don't, we're going to burn you and your father at the stake. Pretty shrewd businessmen, I guess you could say. So she goes to Samson. And she tries to persuade him to give her the riddle. And here's what she says in verse 16. This is so dirty. So Samson's wife came to him, crying, weeping, and said, you hate me. You don't love me. You told my people a riddle, but you have not explained it to me. Look, he said, I haven't explained it to my father or mother, so why should I explain it to you? She wept the whole 7 days of the feast. And finally on the last day, on the 7th day, he got tired of her nagging and he explained it to her. And then she went and explained it to the people. And they went and told Samson the answer. And this infuriated Samson. He responds to them, if you had not plowed with my young heifer, look out, ladies, you wouldn't have known the riddle. And he gets upset. And here's the thing that we need to take from this part of Samson's life. Guys, we have to be careful. Because Samson's wife here, she enticed him, she got control of him, and then she betrayed him. And Samson's wife, the way that she treated Samson is often the way the world will treat us. It will entice us in with promises of blessings and pleasures. It will then control us as we need to constantly seek those blessings and pleasures over and over again. And then before we know it, it'll turn its back on us and leave us out cold and in the dark. This is a man, Samson, who was strong enough to defeat a lion with his bare hands, who's strong enough to break out of the strongest ropes with the littlest of effort. But his weakness was the tears of a woman and the nagging of a lady. It doesn't matter how strong you are, your weakness will be found out. And so we have to be careful with the world today. Because if we're not, we'll be enticed, we'll be controlled, and we will be betrayed by that we think is safe. So Samson was betrayed. He was furious. And God uses this. Samson travels a short distance to another town, perhaps so that word wouldn't get back too fast. He kills 30 Philistine men and strips them of their clothes and brings these clothes to the men that he had promised the clothing to, and he gives them to them. And then he leaves in a huff as he walks away to go and calm down. So he's away for a while, and after he's calmed down, after he's realized that he's kind of over the betrayal, he's over everything, his heart begins to yearn for his young wife. So he takes a goat as an apology and goes back to this young lady. He knocks on their door, and her dad answers, and he says, "I want to go into my wife. I want to see her. I want to go to her room." And he goes, "You can't do that." And he's like, "Why not? She's my wife." And the dad replies, "We didn't think you were coming back, so I gave her to the best man at the wedding." So now he's out of dowry, he's out a wife, and he's upset. So what do you think he does? Well, he doesn't kill anybody yet, but he goes and he looks, and I love what he says here. I don't love what he says here, but it's just ironic to me. He goes, "Well, this time I will be blameless when I harm the Philistines." And so he goes out and he gathers up 300 foxes or jackals, depending on the translation. He ties their tails together. He puts a torch in between it, and they take off, and he lets them go in the fields. And he burns up all of the crops that the Philistines in this area were known for. So all of their year's wages and living is just burnt up. And this infuriates the Philistines. So they find out who did it. They realize it's Samson. So they go to his ex-wife and his ex-father-in-law. They bring them out in the streets and they burn them at the stake because they were responsible for this punishment. It's a vicious world back then, guys. Now, you would think that Samson would be like, "Oh, okay, whatever," and move on. But no, he's upset that they killed his ex-wife. So he becomes enraged. God uses this, and he goes in, and Samson told them, "Because you did this, I swear that I won't rest until I have taken my vengeance on you." In verse 8 in chapter 15, he tore them limb from limb and went down and stayed in the cave at the rock of Edom. This guy just gets worse and worse as it goes along. Now he's just ripping people's arms and legs off. All right? And he gets done, he's tired, and so he goes away and he hides. Well, this presented a problem because there had been a peace between the Philistines and the Israelites. They didn't know he had killed the 30 men before, but now they knew Samson had attacked the Philistines. An Israelite had attacked the Philistines. So now the Philistines are free to retaliate on this peace that had been broken. So they go to the town of Lay. They get into the town of Lay, they sack the town of Lay, and they tell all the men there, "Hey, we want Samson. If you don't bring us Samson, it's not going to be good for you." So the Israelites put an army together, and they go and find Samson. Now here's what's interesting. Samson is going to be forced to defend himself. And we've got to give Samson some credit here. Because he realizes what's at stake. If they don't bring Samson back, then the town of Lay is going to pay for Samson's killings. And so he makes a deal with them. He says, are you guys going to kill me? And they said, no, we're just going to take you to the Philistines. He says, okay, then I'll go, and I'll go willingly. So they tied him up with ropes. They walked him to the Philistines. And they set him in front of the Philistines. And when he sees the Philistines, there's 1,000 of them there. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. And he gets mad again. He breaks the ropes with no effort, reaches down, picks up a fresh jawbone of a donkey. Again, a dead animal. He's not supposed to touch it. And he kills all 1,000 of these Philistines there by himself. And when I was a kid, I was in awe of this story. I was like, whoa, that is a man right there. That dude is awesome. He killed 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey. But as I grew older and I began to read this, my heart began to break. Because how did Samson get to the Philistines? Who accompanied him? A group, a small army of Israelites. Where were they when he was slaughtering these 1,000 men? You see, Samson and the people of Israel had fallen into a trap. A trap that people don't really see, and they don't even realize they're in it. But it's the trap of getting used to the status quo. You see, the Israelites had come to enjoy the fact that the Philistines were over them, and they didn't want to rock the boat. Samson had come to enjoy the fact that he was strong enough to do things on his own, and he didn't need anybody else. And they had come to this place where they had just stayed in what they were used to. They were comfortable in the way. They were going with the flow of the culture and things that were there, and they didn't want to rock the boat. But that's the problem. If you're going to live for God, if you're going to be used by God, if you are going to trust Him as your Lord and Savior, guess what? You can't go along with the status quo. We are called to go against the grain, to go against the water and the flow of the river in life. We are to stand out in the crowd and cause whitewater and to show people, hey, this isn't the way we are supposed to live. But in both cases, in Samson's case and in the Israelites' case, they had just gotten so comfortable with the status quo, Samson just did his own thing. As the single guy, I got it, no worries. And the Israelites just stood there. What if he would have called to them? What if he would have said, come on with me? What if he would have rallied this army? What if he would have built an army? What would have happened? But instead, the army was built to go find him. If he would have led the way that God had probably intended it, Israel could have defeated the Philistines, wiped them out, and there wouldn't be the beginning of dealing with the Philistines at the very beginning of this chapter. It would have been Samson dealt with the Philistines. But they got in the status quo. They went with the flow of the river. They didn't stand out. And here's the thing. Who did stand out? Samson stood out for the wrong reasons, but he stood out. You see, in the Christian life today, we're supposed to stand out. And when you're standing in a raging river and it's only you by your side, it can be very difficult, as we see in Samson's life. But that's the beautiful thing about Christianity. That's the beautiful thing about being a follower of Christ. You're not alone. You should never be standing in the river alone. And I say that because there's about 50 of you in here that should be standing together. And when you go to school and you're rocking the boat and you're talking to your professors and you're disagreeing with their view on science and creation and is there a God, you shouldn't be the only one standing in your class. You shouldn't have to be the only one because that's tough. But God intended it for us to be together, to support each other, to be one another to where we are diverting the flow. We are changing the flow of the river to bring it to Christ. The Israelites and Samson could have worked together and could have defeated the Philistines. But they didn't. I wonder how many of us watch somebody stand by themselves and try to defend their faith, and we don't say a thing. I wonder how many of us have been that only person that stood against the flow of the river and no one came to back you up. So you just turned and went with the flow. Guys, we are called to be different. We are called to stand for the truth and the Word of God. And we have a group of us that are to stand together and fight. Samson defeats these 1,000 men. And it just goes to show you that God is always there. Because something happened in verse 18. It says, Samson defeated these 1,000 men, and he became thirsty. And he called out to the Lord. And he said, and listen to this prayer, "You have accomplished great things. You have accomplished this great victory through" who? "Your servant. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" So God split a hollow place in the ground it lay, and water came out of it. And after Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. So even Samson realized something. He realized that, number one, he was a servant of God, and that without God he was nothing. But yet he only needed God when he only felt he needed God when he was on the brink of death. But he still recognized he needed God. We begin to see Samson's faith with this prayer. But what we have to understand the most is that God sustained His chosen through all of the sin and through all of the failures in his life. And I think that's something that we as Christians need to be reminded of. No matter who you are, no matter what you've done, God loves you. He has a plan for you. And He wants you to come and know Him as your Lord and Savior. And it doesn't matter what you have in your past. He is willing to change your life and to use you much like He used Samson. But Samson's failures were not done. It tells us that he became a judge for over 20 years. And near the end of his life, we get 2 more stories of where Samson failed. And who knows how many other countless times that were there. But it tells us in chapter 16, verses 1 through 3, that Samson went to Gaza. Now this should be interesting. Gaza is again a Philistine town. It's about 40 miles from his hometown. And what does he go to Gaza to do? He went to Gaza where he saw a prostitute and he went to bed with her. His weaknesses popped up again. This time he hasn't married a woman, but he wants the love of a woman. So he goes to Gaza. We don't know why he's there. Maybe he went there specifically for a woman. Maybe he went because he knew it was far enough away that the people he was judge over wouldn't hear about him hiring a prostitute. We don't know, but he went away. The Gazites saw him, recognized who he was, and decided that they were going to capture him. So they locked the city gates, they barred the doors, and they said, we're going to wait till morning, and when he comes out, we're going to jump him, we're going to capture him, and we're going to be the heroes of the Philistines. But Samson didn't wait till morning. At about midnight, he decides to leave. He goes out and he faces a locked gate. And most people would have thought, oh man, that's trouble. Not Samson. He rips the gate off its hinges, out of the ground, and then carries it up a hill. Now it says he carries it to a hill of Hebron. Well, Hebron, the town, was 40 miles away, so it's possible he carried these gates 40 miles away. It's also possible that he just carried the gates up to the top of a hill in the direction of Hebron, and it says that when he got to the top of that hill, he stuck the gates in the top of the hill. Now these gates represented security and safety, and so by sticking them on the hill, he was basically mocking them and saying, you thought you were safe, but now you are not. And he walks off. And a lot of people discuss why this story is in the Scriptures. Why does it talk about this prostitute and the gates? How does that add? And I think it shows us a very important thing. It's not meant to show us his immense strength, I think it's to show us a contradiction between his immense strength and his weakness, his moral weakness. You see, Samson went to Gaza, and he went to find a prostitute. He went to find a lady. Samson was tempting himself. And often there's nothing we can do if Satan or his minions are tempting us. We just have to face it, trust God, run from it. But for Samson, he went looking. He was tempting himself. Oftentimes our character, Samson's character, can deteriorate so much that we don't even have to tempt ourselves. We just need to look for an opportunity to sin. We've degraded ourselves. We've gotten so used to the culture and what the culture says is okay, we don't even need temptation. We just need an opportunity. We just need an unsecured web browser. We just need a party that's got alcohol and drugs. We just need a lonely person that's willing to take an extra step. You don't even got to tempt me. I'm just looking for opportunities. I'm looking for ways to make it happen. But most of the time when we sin, it's because we tempt ourselves or we're looking for opportunities to engage in that sinful act. And we have to turn from that. Samson thought he was strong. Samson thought he could handle it, but he couldn't. And we see how it bites him in the end. The last part of this story is that of Samson and Delilah. Verse 4 through the rest of the chapter. Samson falls in love with this lovely woman, Delilah. They begin dating. Everything is awesome and sweet. And then the Philistine leaders get involved. They go to Delilah, and each of them promises to pay her 1,100 pieces of silver. It's a lot of money. They say, we want you to find Samson's weakness and let us know so that we can capture them. And so Samson, he has a weakness. It's girls. Delilah comes to him. 3 times she comes to him. She goes, hey there, big boy. Look at all your fancy big muscles. Oh, those are so nice. Why are you so strong? Tell me your secret. I think you're awesome. I think you're cute. I just want to know your secret. So Samson tells her, well, if you bind me with ropes and they come upon me, I'll be like a normal man. So he falls asleep. She ties him up. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He breaks out of the rope as if they're nothing. And he escapes. Samson comes back to his love. Oh, you big ox. Why'd you lie to me like that? Don't you know that I love you? Do you love me? Tell me, what's the strength? What makes you so strong? What's the secret? Well, if you bind me with fresh bowstrings from like a bow and arrow, and I will be like a normal man. So again, she ties him up after he falls asleep. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He breaks out like it's nothing, takes off and escapes. And he comes right back to Delilah. Samson, what is wrong with you? Why have you lied to me? Please tell me, what is the secret to your strength? Come on, Samson. Figure it out, man. This is getting crazy. You gotta see. He had to have known. He had to have known the power of a woman. Be careful, gentlemen. So, this time he gets a step closer. He actually gets the hair involved. He says, if you braid my hair and you tie it in a loom and you stake it to the ground, I will be like a normal man. So, when he falls asleep, don't fall asleep, Samson. She braids his hair, ties it to a loom. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He rips that out as if he hadn't even been tied down and escapes. And he comes right back to Delilah. Samson, come on, big man. Tell me. Why are you lying to me? I don't think you love me very much. What is going on here? And she keeps nagging and nagging and nagging. And finally Samson gives in and he tells her the truth. If you shave my head, it's all over. And for some reason this clicked in her mind and she knew it was the truth. So she gathered up the Philistines. He fell asleep. She shaved his head. And I want to read this to you because it breaks my heart. I'm on the wrong page. She says in verse 20 of chapter 16, Samson, the Philistines are here. And he awoke from his sleep and he said, I will escape as I did before and shake myself free. But he did not know the Lord had left him. And he was humbled. He was captured. His eyes were put out and he was forced to grind grain for the Philistines as a prisoner. Samson was big. He was strong, but his weakness got him. You see, it's dangerous to linger in the enemy's border. You may think, well, my morality is strong enough. I'm strong enough. I'm physically able. I can say no. I can dance near the line. I can even cross over the line, but I can handle it. Don't worry, Pastor Luke. Don't worry, Mom and Dad. I got this. I can dance on the line. But I'm here to tell you, you're not strong enough. You're not going to make it. Just like Samson, you were wrong. You will fall. You will not make it. If you rely on your own strength, you will eventually fall. It doesn't matter how strong you are, how great you think you are. It will come back and it will bite you. God doesn't tell us that you will grow strong enough that you can resist temptation and sin. God doesn't sit there and go, with my power, you can get through any temptation, you can overcome any sin. No, what does God say? When sin and temptation enter your life, run. Run from it. Get away as far as you can. You're not strong enough. You won't make it. Run from it.